Paradox of the Dead, written and read by Chris Halton. When I first arrived in the quiet rural backwater of Stratton, Reges, I was unprepared for the profound loneliness that would accompany me. The village, now no more than a rural hamlet, was a survivor of history and circumstance. It had grown quickly as a centre for the medieval wool trade, where weavers used its unique blend of fine quality wool to make the finest cloth and rugs for the discerning, rich and powerful. It soon established a wool merchants' guild, and the wealthy who benefited also generously donated for their ticket into immortality by contributing funds and resources towards the reconstruction of the Church of St. James, then a small wooden building that transformed into the Gothic masterpiece that has stood the test of time on the fringe of the village. As business grew, so did the village, and wealthy merchants built finely carved timber-framed houses walled with wattle, daub and brick for their homes and businesses. By the 17th century, wealth from the woolen trade had gone, and Stratton Reges fell into obscurity as people moved out, and some unwanted homes were taken down and sold for building materials. Another facet towards its demise was only one road leading in and out. In short, a dead end. The village, once a thriving hub of commerce, had now become a quiet, forgotten corner of the world, its past glory fading into the mists of time. I first arrived in July 1930, having been drawn by the appeal of those few preserved merchants' houses and the church. Little more than a street, the village enjoyed amazing views across a rolling countryside of forests, grazing meadows, and a large lake constructed as a folly for a wealthy landowner from a design by the 18th century landscaper Humphrey Repton. This now public facility is a beautiful amenity that the villagers and the odd visitors enjoy in this off-track bijou village. With a comfortable inheritance from a great aunt, I was immediately smitten by the village's serene charm. The thought of living in a bustling town never appealed to me, and the tranquil beauty of this place was enough to make me purchase the dilapidated former Guildhall despite the extensive renovations it required. The very best craftsmen were brought in to restore the structure, consisting of a gabled roof, large leaded glass mullioned windows, and the many decorative carvings on the exterior beams and brackets, making this a uniquely beautiful habitat. The interior layout was equally exquisite, with a large medieval hall and a high ceiling supported by exposed timber beams and trusses, and a grand medieval brick fireplace setting a historic ambience with a magnificent overview provided by a minstrel gallery. The floors, made of sturdy limestone flags, bore witness to the relentless footfall over the centuries, connecting the entire vista into one architectural beauty. A slightly later extension was added to the hall, allowing space to create 3 upper-floor bedrooms, a large kitchen, a bathroom, and enough room for a study and library. The rear garden consisted of a small stream and willow trees encompassed by a brick wall, to which I later added a new lawn and flowering borders. All in all, I was satisfied and felt grounded. By November of that year, I had finally moved into the hall after the last craftsman had left. Being much quieter now than in the summer, the village seemed to go into a winter hibernation state. Very few visitors travelled out here, and the 50-odd residents kept themselves to themselves, especially as I was viewed by and large as an interloper. However, the local pub and general store were grateful for my business, as money is money regardless of where it comes from. Living alone and unattached was only compensated by my surroundings, but living in a gilded cage soon became monotonous as I craved human company. As an aside, I did have a local housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, who came in for an hour daily to dust and clean. Being a simple yet kindly lady in her early 60s, she provided little company, although she proved helpful with her local knowledge of the village. While polite, the villagers kept their distance. Their suspicion of me was evident in their cautious glances and hushed conversations whenever I passed by. Following Mrs. Simmons' suggestion, I decided to visit St. James's Church, a medieval architectural marvel that lived up to its reputation. As I admired the building, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories it held within its ancient walls. Externally, the bell tower was a magnificent edifice standing 130 feet tall. Like the church, it was built with grey Barnack limestone and stood with fierce pride like some old maid doting over her charges towards the village below. The church's exterior, with its richly decorated facade, was a testament to the wealth and power of the early wool merchants. The fine carvings of gargoyles and grotesques, and the augmented carvings of clerical figures were a sight to behold. Walking through an unusually late architectural oddity of an arched crenellated doorway, I was deeply impressed with the medieval craftsmanship, evidenced by ribbed vaults and flying buttresses. These created massive space as one was drawn skywards to appreciate the light airiness of the entire structure. From here, one could also appreciate the huge leaded windows of Flemish glass stamped with the armorial bearings of those who contributed to its construction and internally adorned with graves and monuments of the wool merchant families. As I admired the building, I was approached by an elderly man wearing a clerical collar who introduced himself as the Reverend Lionel Williamson. He stood slightly haunched and was in his early 70s, with a medium build, wearing a grey drooping cardigan and baggy brown trousers. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and had a pleasant demeanour. He shook my hand and inquired, "Haven't seen you here before. Are you the chap who bought and restored the old Guildhall?" "Yes," I said, and told him how much I enjoyed living there. Being shorter in stature, he looked up at me with a wide, toothy grin and much exaggerated eyes caused by the thick lens of his glasses and said, "You should join one of our services here next Sunday, where it'll allow you to meet the locals. They can be quite insular, but at least it'll break the ice with some of them." He paused briefly to see my reaction and said, "So how about that?" I smiled and said, "Of course, Vicar. And, by the way, my name is Alec Hammond." He patted my left arm and said, "Capital, capital. Now please excuse me, Alec, as I have a few visits to make around the village. I look forward to seeing you at the 10 a.m. service." He walked away towards the vestry, waving from behind as he disappeared behind a curtain screen. As I left the church, I wandered around the churchyard with its well-tended lawns and ancient yew trees. I casually looked at the names of those interred upon headstones, which stood row upon row like broken teeth across the cemetery. Within this arrangement of funerary order, I spotted alone a magnificent grave monument shaped like a giant finial-pointed urn, decorated with garlands and swags of stone flowers from top to base. When I approached, I caught the smell of the most extraordinary perfume odour. Even now, as I record these events, I could not begin to describe it. It was heavenly, and yet at first I could not see anyone who may have worn it near where I stood. There was a soft, gentle breeze, and it was warm and sunny, so I assumed this combination brought it from afar. And so my attention again returned to this funereal-type urn to read any legend or named engraving upon it. And there it was in beautiful copperplate writing. "Here lieth the mortal remains of Elena Dyson, who departed this world in the year of our Lord, 1820. Aged 28. Requies in parture." One detail I omitted to mention was that the base of the stone urn was pinned over at each corner by thick metal stapling rods that followed the contours of the raised plinth where it stood. Further, it was surrounded by pointed iron fencing palisades that, although ornate, indicated that entry to the urn was forbidden. I thought this strange, but then I remembered the legend of Birkenhair and the army of body snatchers that, from the 18th to 19th centuries, historically removed freshly laid corpses for anatomical research. I assumed that was the case. Realizing the hour was heading towards lunch, I turned away to the stone-flagged path to head home. Just then, I very briefly caught what I assumed was a raven-haired lady walking into the shadow of a large clump of yew trees some 40 feet from where I stood. The exposure of my sighting was brief and scant, so I put this down to a hyperactive imagination and continued on my way. The following Sunday I arrived at St. James before 10 a.m., perhaps somewhat nervously, expecting to meet silenced hostility from the locals, but my misgivings turned out to be ill-founded, and perhaps begrudgingly some said hello as they filed past the vicar into the church as he greeted them individually. He appeared surprised to see me, and once everyone was seated, the service began. Before properly conducting the service, he introduced me to a congregation of around 40 people whose lives range from children to adults. Some applause was given, although others tended to shield away. I mused quietly to myself, we are all God's children, but I apparently am not if I am their new neighbour. While being introduced to the congregation, I again smelt the same perfume I noticed previously in the cemetery. As last time, it had no discernible source despite my discreet sniffs in the air. I also looked for any dark-haired women that would fit the albeit brief introduction I experienced in the churchyard. Again, nothing. I was perplexed. I felt I was being teased, but by whom and for what reason? I put all such thoughts to one side as I sat for the service, which was concluded in about an hour, and thankfully perhaps no long drawn-out monologues from the vicar. As the congregation got up and left the pews, I looked to see whether I could pick up that rich perfume again, but no such essence was detected in the air. After thanking the vicar for his service, I left alone and walked along the meandering church path to the Lich Gate to make my way home. As I passed through, and amid the chatter of sparrows in a neighbouring tree, I thought, and I say thought, that I heard a voice call my name. It was odd that the voice was seemingly on another plane, as its audio ambience differed from the real-life sounds around me. But at that time I put it down to my imagination and continued home without further incident. Nothing of note occurred for the next few days, and my life followed its usual pace as it did for most days. However, I eventually met one person, an amateur historian named James Bryce, of whom I had occasion to speak to when I was in the general store. He had heard that I had bought the old Guildhall and struck up an acquaintance with me, which resulted in me extending an invitation for him to visit my home to look at the renovation work I had carried out. He arrived at 2 p.m. the following day, just after Mrs. Simmons had left to return home. James was a man in his late 30s with a mop of dark brown hair that matched his full beard. He was dressed casually in an open shirt, heavy pullover and light-coloured trousers. He taught at a grammar school in Burford, where he now resided some 10 miles from here. He told me that he lived in the village as a child, where his father was the doctor, but he had since sadly passed away some 15 years ago. He mentioned he had previously been here to admire the outside restoration of the Guildhall, but all he saw were workmen present. It was pure chance that we met while at the store, and he was pleasantly pleased to see it fully restored. After a brief tour of the house, which he greatly enjoyed, we settled in the lounge over a glass of port and some cheese and pickles I had bought from the general store. Once settled, he excitedly said, "You have done remarkable work here. Your restorers have brought out the best in the old house." "Yes," I replied, "but you can thank my late great-aunt Matilda, who provided for it in her will." He then added, "I remember coming in here as a kid. It was old Mr. Tyler who lived here then. He used part of the building as a cobbler's shop, and the scent of leather and old oak made a remarkable odour. Oh, such memories." His mention of a smell prompted me to share my experiences at the church. He looked intrigued as I related my story, saying, "That grave, the one to Elena Dyson. I am reminded of a book the predecessor doctor gave my father when he took over in 1890. It was a ledger of accounts with clients dating back to the early 1800s, and I do remember this name quite well. They were the wealthy landowners who built the lake we have today. My father told me that the parents died by the mid-1840s, some years after Eleanor's passing. I interjected, and I noticed that her grave was protected with iron spikes and railings, which I assumed was because of the fear of grave robbers. He said with a bemused smile, "I know, doesn't all of this sound crazy?" He agreed to find this ledger buried with other family items in the attic and contact me again in a few days. A short while later he left as it was now turning towards dusk, and he didn't fancy driving back on the rough roads in these parts, which were constructed of compressed stone rubble, which was the fashion in the days before tarmac. The meeting and conversation with James were interesting, and I couldn't wait to see what the ledger revealed. Before turning into bed that night, I was surprised to hear someone tapping on the downstairs window glass, and shortly afterwards the front door. While in my nightclothes, I came downstairs and opened the door. Nobody was there, but that perfume smell permeated the air heavily around the door. With a flashlight, I went outside, and to be perfectly frank, I was terrified. As there was no street lighting, everything was in darkness, except for the lights coming from neighbouring properties. But despite checking around the hall, I saw no one apart from that smell of a heavy scent, which was now a sickly essence. I quickly returned to the hall. Something I felt was very unpleasant was in the air, making me feel quite uncomfortable and vulnerable. After ensuring every door and window was firmly locked, I went to my bedroom and slept an hour later, leaving my bedroom light on until dawn. Such was the discomfort I felt. After that night, nothing further happened, and I felt more comfortable again. My brain was reinterpreting this experience as a bad dream, but I knew this was real on a conscious level, and I was deeply concerned and apprehensive about the future. Fortunately, a few days later, I was again visited by James Bryce, who brought with him an ancient ledger that recorded accounts of past clients of the village doctor from the early to the mid-19th century. The ledger represented what doctors would now call a patient's medical record, with the only difference being that then this record included a financial account for fees paid by patients to the practice. He said enthusiastically, "Boy, have I some news for you." Once settled at my kitchen table, he opened the ledger. He explained briefly that by coincidence the Reges Dyson family lived at the old Guildhall and were, by all accounts, very wealthy, having acquired their fortune from their ancestors' dealings in the wool trade. James then went on to explain what he had discovered in relation to Eleanor Reges Dyson's demise. Having put on a pair of thin-rimmed round spectacles, and having cleared his throat, he said, "According to the doctor's notes, Eleanor was suffering from a rare blood condition that she picked up from a tick bite while staying in Italy with her uncle in 1820. However, she became deathly pale and she was brought home immediately, where her condition quickly worsened and she died from what was recorded as consummation. She was buried a short time afterwards, and the family, as noted here, were deeply heartbroken and bereft of their loss." I said, "But that doesn't explain the security around her grave, which is just as odd." Closing the ledger and removing his spectacles, James added, "I think you'll need to speak to the vicar about that, Alec. He might have further information that would explain this." After chatting for an hour, James left after I promised I would update him on my meeting with the vicar. That night, just before turning into bed, I heard further taps on the downstairs window glass and a rap at the door. This time I turned the lights off in the lounge, pulled the curtains slightly open, and saw a beautiful dark-haired woman in her 20s, wearing a red cape with a hood standing near the door. She had a look of urgency on her face, and I briefly felt relieved that what I was seeing was a real person and not some hideous phantom from demonology. Confidently, I went to open the door, but just before pulling the door bolts and opening the latch, I chilled with terror when I again smelt that perfume. A female voice whispered, "Please let me in. I am cold." A heavier tap followed this, and the voice became more agitated and louder, saying, "Let me in. I need to come in." Then the whole door and frame shook as the voice screamed, "Damn you, sir, I have to come in." I recited Psalm 23, verse 4. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." I nervously shouted, "In the name of God, go!" Silence immediately returned, and the smell and the woman was gone. I was in a state of shock. I turned my back on the door, and my breathing was heavy as I slid down its surface to my knees. My head was briefly spinning, but I regained control and returned to my room. I left the outside door light and all the lights in the house on until dawn. I finally realized that this manifestation was once Elena Dyson, and I was sure her spirit had returned from the grave to haunt me. This thought left me chilled and very vulnerable. Later in the morning I saw the vicar at the church and shared the entire story with him. He comforted me and asked me to follow him to Eleanor's grave. Once we arrived, he mentioned the palisaded fence and the iron spikes. Turning to me, he said, "I know she wasn't buried this way to keep out body snatchers. No, quite the contrary. Her family buried her this way to prevent her from leaving her grave. The story is that they believe she was bitten abroad by a vampire." He looked me directly into my face. He added, "According to what I was told by a local here many years ago, she was last seen in the 1840s emerging from her grave as a misty form by a verger who claimed that this mist turned into a beautiful woman wearing the hooded cape you saw. But frankly, I believe this all to be nonsense, especially as the verger was a man known to enjoy the odd tipple, and despite that, you claim you saw a hooded woman last night at your home. This could have been anyone. And what if she was a real woman in distress? You had left her outside, vulnerable and afraid." He stopped to look around and said, "And if this were claimed to be true, it would defy all the known rules of science. There is only one spirit, my son, and that is our Lord Saviour God." "Surely," I added, "that lends some credence to the story." He smiled. "I appreciate your earnest heart in these matters, but this is 1930, not 1840. We in the Anglican Church no longer believe in this nonsense. If it makes you feel safer, I will give you a flask of holy water should you feel disposed of for protection." I felt he was being unnecessarily cruel and harsh and giving me no spiritual comfort at all. I declined his offer and returned home. Nothing happened that night, and I enjoyed a peaceful sleep. The vicar's remarks had, however, utterly irritated me, and he, I thought, a man of God. But events took an unlikely turn when I discovered while shopping in the general store the next day that the vicar was found dead that morning in the churchyard, having died from a suspected heart attack. He had failed to return to his parish house, and his housekeeper had reported him missing much earlier in the morning. As a result, the verger had attended the church where he had discovered his body not far from the Dyson grave monument. The local doctor from Burford, who attended the scene with an ambulance, had issued a death certificate as he was known to have had a serious heart condition, and his body gave every indication of a heart attack. According to what I was also told was that his face was stricken with terror, which could have been the result of this sudden attack. Or, as I thought, he may have met Eleanor, and their matters lay at rest. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. It was as though all I had experienced was a bad dream, and I started feeling much more relaxed. One night, while fast asleep, I was awoken by the voices of 3 people arguing from next door in the hall. Half dazed, I clambered out of bed and walked to the minstrel gallery overlooking the floor below in the hall. It looked much different than how I restored it, and now I saw that it had a great oak table set with benches and tapestries upon the walls. Seated were a middle-aged man and woman and a younger woman, who was in her 20s and who I recognized as Eleanor. The man, a well-built fellow with a bushy beard wearing a frock coat and a collarless shirt, was banging on the table and stood opposite Eleanor, seated at the table and crying. He demanded that she stop seeing a man called Henry, who he regarded as being of a lesser class than themselves, and the woman I assumed was Eleanor's mother, a large lady wearing a crinoline dress, pleaded with her to listen to her father. At that moment all the characters disappeared into a mist, and then another tableau appeared of Eleanor being ordered out of the house by her father, who was enraged and screaming at her. I saw her wearing the hooded red cape and understood from his anger that she would leave the country to stay with her uncle in Italy. She was beside herself with grief and pleaded to stay. A footman dressed in a Regency-style jacket and trousers carried her luggage outside. From the gallery window I saw an awaiting coach and impatient horses, and I also saw she was now being dragged on board by her father as she pleaded hysterically in tears to stay. Her father, a blunt, arrogant man, screamed, "You will only come home when you agree to stop seeing this man." With her luggage loaded, the coach departed. The next scene I bore privy to was her return home, which I again witnessed from the gallery. In this final tableau, which was rotating scenes, her almost pale and lifeless body was carried into the hall by two footmen in a wicker stretcher, where they placed her onto an improvised bed set up in that room. Then the imagery switched to a doctor surrounded by her family, feeling her pulse, and then shaking his head dismissively before walking away. And the final scene of her weeping mother on her knees, holding her body as a local priest administered the last rites. This was the most moving scene of all, with her father standing in one corner of the hall with his head bent as in prayer, but he was crying. At this point I passed out. When I awoke in the morning I was actually in my nightwear in bed. I had a horrific headache as though I had been drinking, which I had not, and the memory of Eleanor's encounter with her family flooded back into my mind. Was it a dream? I could no longer be sure, but I felt her family had wronged her, and this time I intended to put matters straight by helping her if she called again. For the next few days nothing whatsoever happened as the day passed into night and then dawn again. However, I did pay a visit to her grave and rendered a personal homily after placing a bouquet of roses upon it. It was then that I smelt her perfume and knew she was there. The atmosphere felt warm and almost forgiving, and I returned to the hall feeling much better for that experience. And here is the last segment in this unhappy saga. 2 nights later, again late at night, I smelt perfume in the hall area. Again there was a tapping on the window glass and then on the door, and this time I was determined to see this through to completion. I heard her voice again, pleading to be let in, and I opened the door. As in life, I saw Eleanor's figure and face, wearing a red cape over a beautiful dress made of lightweight, delicate silk, which bore a soft pastel shade of pale blue. The bodice featured intricate embroidery and delicate lace detailing, which added a touch of elegance. She stood smiling at me, and her face was full of colour and the vigour of youth. I smiled back and beckoned her to enter, and her figure seemingly floated across the floor, where I now saw her parents and a young, fair-headed man waiting for her with open arms. As they embraced her, the figures melted into a mist and disappeared, leaving the lingering smell of that beautiful perfume. It was, I felt, now over. The historical wrongs of the past had been put to right, and she was finally reunited. But here one might deduce the story was over, but not quite so. I returned one more time to visit her grave and saw that the palisaded fence was much lower to no more than a foot in height, and the metal spikes were missing. Her name, too, was different. She was now Eleanor Johnson, and she died in 1900 and was buried with her husband, Henry. Even stranger was that the formerly late Reverend Lionel Williamson was very much alive, and he told me that Eleanor was a kindly benefactor to the church and had bequeathed money from her will for its upkeep. I realized from this moment that all I had experienced had been wiped from the timeline of history and replaced with this version for which I was most happy to live, knowing that everything had finally been made good. And so I conclude, did I change time, or was this all a creation of my own imagination, and that I will now never know? The end.